My name is Naomi Brooks, and for the past 2 years, I've worked as a housemaid in the Whitford estate, a massive countryside mansion surrounded by rolling hills and glass-like ponds. The kind of place where chandeliers shine brighter than the stars outside, and silence feels too expensive to disturb. I came here not for the pay, but for the peace. After losing my husband in an accident and struggling to start over, cleaning floors and serving tea in a quiet house felt like a kind of therapy. The Whitfords weren't cruel, at least not at first. Mr. Richard Whitford, the head of the family, was polite, reserved, and rarely home. He had inherited his billions from real estate ventures and had the calm confidence of a man who never needed to prove anything. His mother, Mrs. Eleanor Whitford, lived with him, a graceful woman in her late 70s who loved classical music, tea with honey, and short conversations about the past. And then came Isabel, Richard's fiancée. Isabel arrived like a summer storm, beautiful, loud, and impossible to ignore. She was everything you'd imagine a billionaire's future wife to be: tall, blonde, elegant, and always perfectly styled. Her perfume trailed behind her like a warning, her voice sharp enough to slice through quiet rooms. Everyone in the house knew when she was around because the air seemed to change, heavier, colder. From the first day, Isabel treated me like a stain she couldn't scrub out. She never said it directly, but her tone carried it. "You don't belong here." At first, I thought it was nerves. Maybe she felt out of place in such a big house, marrying into old money. But then I started noticing the small cruelties. The way she'd ask me to redo things that were already perfect. The way she'd look at me when Richard wasn't around, that slow, measuring stare, as if I was something beneath her. But I endured it. I always did. Everything changed one bright morning, the kind of morning that makes you forget bad things exist. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, and the marble floors glowed gold. Mrs. Whitford was sitting in the living room, wrapped in a lavender shawl, sipping tea as I polished the silver trays nearby. She had been having trouble walking lately, and I'd become her helper, her company, really. We'd talk for hours while I worked. She'd tell me stories about Richard's childhood, her late husband, and how money, in her words, was both a blessing and a curse. It built walls faster than it built homes. That morning, she asked me softly, "Naomi, would you play that old Chopin piece for me again?" I smiled. "Of course, ma'am." I went to the grand piano by the window, my fingers moving gently over the keys. It was peaceful until Isabel's heels clicked across the floor. She appeared in the doorway, wearing a black silk dress and a glare sharp enough to stop the music mid-note. "Really, Mother Whitford," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You've turned my maid into your entertainer now." Mrs. Whitford looked up, startled. "Isabel, dear," she was just. "Just what?" Isabel stepped closer. "Playing piano in the middle of the day while the house still looks like a mess." I froze, unsure what to say. "She's been very helpful," Mrs. Whitford began again, her voice trembling. But Isabel cut her off with a scoff. "Helpful? She's a maid, not your friend, and I don't like her hanging around you all day like a pet." I could feel my throat tighten, but I stayed silent. I'd learned that silence was my armor. Richard wasn't home. He had left early for a meeting in the city, leaving the two of them alone and me caught between them. That was when it happened. Mrs. Whitford tried to stand, leaning on her cane, but her knees gave way. I rushed forward to help her, catching her just before she fell. But in that same moment, Isabel's voice rose, cold and furious. "Don't touch her." I looked up, confused. Isabel marched over, her heels striking the floor like thunder. "You think you can play the savior now? You're overstepping, Naomi." "I was just helping." "Helping?" Isabel's face twisted into something cruel. "You're lucky we even let you in this house. Don't pretend you belong here." Mrs. Whitford gasped, "Isabel, stop this." but Isabel ignored her completely. The next second felt unreal, like something out of a nightmare. Isabel's hand shot forward, knocking the cane out of the old woman's grasp. Mrs. Whitford stumbled and fell to the floor, gasping. "Enough!" I cried, rushing to help her, but Isabel turned on me next. "You stay out of this," she hissed. I dropped to my knees beside Mrs. Whitford. The elderly woman looked up at me, frightened and trembling. "Naomi, dear, it's all right," she whispered, but it was. Isabel stood above us both, her dress shimmering in the golden light, her expression a mix of disgust and satisfaction. She lifted her foot and pressed the tip of her heel against Mrs. Whitford's cane, pinning it to the floor as if claiming victory. "Maybe next time," she sneered, "you'll remember your place." At that moment, something inside me snapped, not with anger but with resolve. I met her gaze, calm and unflinching. "You'll regret this," I said softly. She smirked. "Oh, I doubt that." But she had no idea, none at all, that the very thing she tried to destroy that morning would be the reason her world collapsed days later. For the rest of that day, the mansion felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves knew something terrible had happened. Mrs. Whitford had retreated to her room to rest, her wrist bruised from the fall. I checked on her quietly through the evening, making sure she had her tea and pain medication. Every time I saw her trembling hands, guilt pressed deeper into my chest. It wasn't my fault, and yet it felt like it was. Because I had seen it. I had let it happen. Isabel's cruelty wasn't new, but this time it had gone too far. I'd seen the way she looked at Mrs. Whitford, like she was an inconvenience standing between her and the billionaire's fortune. That night, as the mansion grew silent and the lights dimmed, I stood outside Mrs. Whitford's room, holding the tray she hadn't touched. I heard her soft crying through the door, muffled, broken. And in that moment, I promised myself she would never cry because of Isabel again. But revenge wasn't something I planned. It wasn't about shouting or fighting. It was about truth. And truth I already had plenty of. You see, what Isabel didn't know was that I'd been cleaning this house long enough to know where all its secrets hid, in drawers, in email drafts left open, in careless words spoken on phone calls. Wealth makes people reckless. They assume their privacy is protected by status. But the thing about cruelty is, it always leaves evidence. 2 mornings later, Richard returned from his business trip. He came home early. Unannounced, the way good men do when they miss their families. His mother's face lit up when she saw him step into her room with a bouquet of white lilies. "Mother, I came as soon as I could," he said, gently taking her hand. "You said you had a fall." Mrs. Whitford forced a smile. "It was nothing, my dear, just a little misstep." But Richard wasn't convinced. He noticed the bruise on her wrist, the faint mark near her shoulder. His eyes flicked toward me for a moment, and I could see it, the question forming silently. What really happened here? Before I could speak, Isabel swept into the room wearing a powder blue dress and her usual confidence. "Oh, darling, you're back early." She moved quickly to kiss his cheek, but Richard didn't look at her, not yet. He just said quietly, "Mother says she fell." "Yes," Isabel replied, her tone bright but too quick. "She tripped on her cane, poor thing. I told her she should rest more." Mrs. Whitford's eyes dropped to her lap. I saw her lips press together, not in agreement, but in restraint. Richard didn't press further. He only nodded, and the room fell into a polite, suffocating silence. But that silence didn't last long. Because later that day, when Richard went to his study, something happened that changed everything. I was dusting near the staircase when I heard it, raised voices from the study down the hall. Isabel's voice, sharp as glass. You're seriously listening to her now." Then Richard's calm, controlled tone. "Isabel, I'm asking where you were when my mother fell." "I told you what happened." "I'm asking again," he said, voice tightening. "Because my mother's nurse said she heard shouting, and Naomi said she found my mother on the floor crying." That was the first time I'd ever heard Richard speak my name like that, not as the help, but as someone who mattered. I froze at the corner of the hallway, heart racing. Isabel's tone changed. "You're taking a maid's word over mine." "I'm taking evidence over excuses," Richard replied evenly. A long silence followed. Then Isabel's laughter, bitter, forced. "Evidence? What did your little maid record me now?" And then she went quiet. Because she realized, in that single slip of sarcasm, that maybe she should have been worried about that. That night, when everyone was asleep, I sat on my bed staring at my phone. In my gallery were the photos I'd taken the day of the incident: Mrs. Whitford's bruised wrist, the shattered glass on the floor, and Isabel's reflection caught in the mirror above mid-yell, her face twisted in cruelty. I hadn't planned to use them, but when I remembered the look in Richard's eyes, I knew he deserved to know everything. I didn't send the photos directly. Instead, I left an anonymous envelope on his desk the next morning. No name, no note, just a flash drive inside. Inside it were two things: the photos and the security footage from the hallway camera Isabel had forgotten existed. The camera she had demanded to remove months ago, claiming it spoiled the daycare. But the butler never removed it. He just turned it slightly to the side, and it had captured everything. When Richard saw the footage, the truth didn't just hit him, it shattered him. I'll never forget that morning. Isabel was in the garden, pretending to water flowers for a photo shoot she had planned, when Richard came out of the mansion, holding the flash drive in his hand. His face was pale, his jaw tight. "Isabel," he said, voice low, shaking with fury, "what did you do?" She blinked, confused at first, then saw the flash drive. Her fake calm shattered instantly. "Richard, it's not what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like," he shouted. "You pushed her, my mother." Her face drained of color. She tripped. I saw the video. The sound echoed across the marble courtyard. Guests and staff froze mid-step. Even the birds seemed to fall silent. Isabel tried to reach for him, but he stepped back. "Don't touch me!" His voice was a blade. "You disgust me." I was standing by the doorway, holding a tray I'd nearly dropped. She saw me then, and for the first time she didn't look powerful. She looked small. "You," she hissed, her voice trembling. "You did this." But Richard cut her off. "No, Isabel, you did this. Naomi just told the truth." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. That evening, when the guests had gone and Isabel's things were packed, Richard found me in the hallway, near the piano where everything had begun. He stopped a few feet away, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "Naomi, thank you." I shook my head. "You don't have to." "I do," he said firmly. "You saved my mother." I smiled faintly. "I just did what was right." He hesitated, then said quietly, "The truth is, Naomi, you did the unthinkable. Not because you exposed her, but because you had every reason to hate this house, and yet you protected it." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it's quiet, and it wears the face of dignity. After that day, the mansion was never the same. The echo of Isabel's voice, her cruelty, her laughter, it all disappeared overnight. The house grew quieter, lighter. The maids whispered less. The air didn't feel heavy anymore. Even Mrs. Whitford seemed to breathe easier, like she'd finally been freed from something that had been haunting her. Isabel was gone. Richard had made sure of that. Word spread quickly among the staff, the guests, even in the nearby town. The engagement was called off, the ring returned, and Isabel's name wiped clean from the guest lists of every gala she once dreamed of attending. She had humiliated others in luxury, but now she'd lost it all in public disgrace. And yet, I didn't feel joy when I heard the news. I just felt peace. Because revenge, I realized, isn't about hurting someone the way they hurt you. It's about balance, about watching truth correct what lies have ruined. A week later, Richard asked to see me in his study, the same room where I used to quietly dust the shelves, pretending not to hear the arguments that echoed through the walls. This time it was silent, warm. He was standing by the fireplace when I entered, his mother sitting nearby, wrapped in a soft lavender shawl. She looked healthier now, her smile returning little by little. "Naomi," Richard said, motioning for me to sit, "I want to thank you again properly." "There's no need, sir," I replied, keeping my eyes down. "I just did what anyone would have done." Mrs. Whitford chuckled gently. "No, my dear, most people would have stayed silent. You didn't." I felt a lump rise in my throat. Richard continued, his tone firm yet kind. "You've worked for us for 3 years, and in that time you've shown loyalty, grace, and strength I can't even begin to describe. My mother and I discussed it. And we'd like to make some changes." He handed me a small envelope. Inside was a letter and a document that nearly made me drop it. It was a formal offer. A full-time position, house manager. Double my salary, my own quarters, full benefits. "I can't accept this," I whispered. "Yes, you can," he said gently. "Because this isn't charity, it's respect, something you've earned." Mrs. Whitford smiled. "You stood for me when no one else did. Let me stand for you now." I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. I tried to speak, but all I managed was a quiet, "Thank you." Richard nodded, his expression softening. "You did the unthinkable, Naomi, not just for us, but for yourself. You showed that silence can be strength, that grace can be revenge." That evening, as the sun set over the countryside estate, I stood outside near the fountain. The golden light poured across the gardens, glinting off the water. It was the same light that had once exposed my humiliation, but now it felt different. It felt like freedom. The birds sang, the air smelled of rain and lilies, and for the first time in years I smiled, a real, peaceful smile. I thought about Isabel wherever she was. Maybe she'd learned something from what happened, maybe not, but it didn't matter anymore. Because she no longer had the power to define me. That power belonged to me now. A few weeks later, Richard hosted a small charity dinner at the mansion. It wasn't like the grand parties Isabel used to plan. This one was warm, intimate, filled with laughter and sincerity. As I oversaw the final preparations, one of the new maids whispered to me, "Miss Naomi, is it true that you're the one who exposed the fiancé?" I smiled faintly, arranging the silverware. "People will say all sorts of things. Just remember, truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand tall." When the guests arrived, Mrs. Whitford raised a toast, not to wealth, not to luxury, but to dignity. And as glasses clinked, I felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had survived something designed to break me, and turned it into my strength. Later that night, after everyone had gone, Richard found me again in the hall. "You know," he said, leaning slightly against the doorframe, "I still can't believe how much you've changed this house." I smiled, brushing my hands on my apron. "I didn't change it, sir. I just cleaned it." He laughed softly, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere genuine. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Naomi, this house didn't need a maid. It needed a heart, and you gave it one. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, holding back tears, and walked away quietly, the way I always did. But this time I walked taller. Because sometimes the people the world looks down on, the ones who bow, who clean, who serve, are the ones holding everything together. And when they finally rise, they do it with more grace than anyone ever expects. That's the kind of revenge that doesn't just hurt, it heals. What would you do if you were in Naomi's place? Would you stay silent, or would you do the unthinkable too? Tell us in the comments. We read every one of them. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video. Subscribe for more powerful stories of betrayal, justice, and silent revenge. And share it with someone who needs to be reminded that karma always comes quietly, but surely.